I think most people would be in agreement that the Resident Evil series had gone through a bit of a change since the first games had released. The newer entries in the series had moved away from the survival horror elements that were the key foundations in the earlier games, and had instead moved towards a more action-centered style of game that just so happened to have zombies. This change was met with extremely mixed reception from fans and critics alike, with Resident Evil 6 receiving extremely mixed reviews, although it would go on to become one of Capcom's best-selling games. Clearly, a change was needed, and Resident Evil 7 was certainly a dramatic U-turn, with the game returning back to its survival horror roots, but with some drastic changes, the most notable of which is the move from third-person to first-person gameplay, allowing for VR capabilities. The game has little to do with previous entries in the series, but that does not mean that there are not lots of references to earlier events which can be found in the numerous notes and documents in the game. You play as Ethan Winters, who has been drawn to what is believed to be an abandoned house after receiving a video message from his 3-year missing wife, Mia. Arriving at the house, it is quickly apparent that something is very wrong. Soon Ethan finds the, unstable Mia, but is quickly captured by the father of the house's family, Jack Baker.
Welcome to the family, son.
After a lovely dinner party, Ethan escapes, and with the help from the elusive daughter of the family, Zoe, attempts to find Mia and escape the Bakers. Of course, this is not an easy task, as Ethan must do this while being hunted by the parents of the family, Jack and Marguerite, and while evading the traps set up by the son Lucas. But Ethan is not entirely helpless, as he is quite the hoarder, with him accumulating quite the impressive arsenal of weapons to defend himself with. These weapons are acquired in different ways. The knife is straight up given to you, and while it isn't advisable, it is possible to complete the game with just the knife. Some of the other weapons can be found laying around, but several of them require relatively simple puzzles or the finding of items to be able to fully utilise them. And he will need these weapons to help defend himself from the Bakers. Each one of them is deadly in their own right, and must be dealt with cautiously. Jack is just a powerhouse, with him relentlessly hunting you, shouting taunts as he does. You can choose to run away or shoot him, but even if you manage to defeat him, he'll just get back up within a short space of time. No matter how many times you think you have killed him, he always comes back, seemingly stronger than ever. If you are scared of insects, Marguerite might be your worst nightmare. She isn't as aggressive as Jack, but instead relies on a swarm of insects to hunt down and devour you. Lucas creates elaborate and brutal traps, which if you are not careful can quickly bring an end to Ethan's life. However, the Bakers aren't the only enemies that confront the player. These other enemies are called the Moulded, which are gooey monsters created from some of the Bakers' previous victims. Unfortunately, while they certainly are creepy to look at, they are not exactly the best. The Moulded suffer from a few problems, primarily that after the first few encounters with them, they kind of lose their intimidation. You will pick up very quickly that the blocking ability more often than not negates the majority of the damage from their attacks. It feels like the Moulded were created to be a replacement for the zombies from earlier games, but they just don't work as well. Most of the time, the Moulded come oozing out of the surroundings, which could have been such an amazing way to build up tension, but the visual cues of the areas they appear in are so obvious that the vast majority of the time, it is easy to tell when they will appear. There are 4 different types of Moulded that can appear in the game. The first is just a standard type of Moulded, which can take a fair amount of bullets before being put down. The second type is essentially the same, just with a single big arm, that does extra damage, making it also more deadly, but this version is not too common. There is also one which moves on all 4s, making it far faster than any of the other types, with it even leaping towards the player. However, it has a far smaller amount of health than any of the others. The final form that can appear is far more intimidating, with it being just this massive Moulded, being able to deal insane damage, and having a large health pool. Despite being slow, they can deal out large amounts of damage with its melee attacks, and also have a ranged vomit attack which can stun you if hit by it. They also explode when defeated, making them even more of a deadly threat. The enemies in the game are kind of a shame, because on one hand, we have enemies which are intimidating, and make you consider what your next move is going to be, even if they can be outmaneuvered with relative ease once you know what you are doing. On the other hand, we have zombie knockoffs, which tend to be more of a nuisance than any serious threat the majority of the time, with them being huge bullet sponges that get old very quickly. There are a number of boss fights in the game, some of which vary greatly in quality. I personally think that the majority of them are really good and can be downright terrifying of just how powerful some of the bosses do feel. Although it is worth mentioning that some of the boss fights can be annoying if you aren't prepared or are on your first playthrough. The final boss fight though is just a massive letdown, with it being just kind of a boring and extremely easy fight. I can't really say too much though without going into spoilers. Just like with other Resident Evils, inventory management plays a massive part in the experience of the game. There is extremely limited space in the player's inventory, which can be increased by finding backpacks scattered around the baker's home. However, these are few and far between, meaning players are required to prioritise what they will take with them. You must also consider that story items do take up space in the inventory, which just goes to add another limit to what you can carry. Some players may find this system annoying and restrictive, but for me personally, it goes to add another layer of tension to the game, as it means you have to put a lot of thought into what you are going to take with you and what you are going to need for the next section. Although, you very rarely have to throw away the items that you already have, because there are several storage boxes which act as a cloud storage system, allowing you to take the items out from any other storage box. These boxes are located within safe rooms, which as the name suggests, acts as a safe haven for Ethan to hide from the enemies hunting him, and are the only place you can make manual saves. There are a decent number of these safe rooms, but they are carefully placed around, so that running to them is not always the best option when facing a superior threat, unless they are extremely close by. Baker House itself, with its hidden secrets and puzzles, brings back memories of the Spencer Mansion. I really cannot credit enough the just brilliant attention to detail and atmosphere the game creates, as you cautiously wander through the house, unsure of what awaits around the next corner. There are several puzzles, some of which are mandatory, and some of which are optional to get extra loot. These puzzles aren't particularly hard, with the game usually communicating pretty well what you need to do. Take for example the shotgun. When you first get into the main hall, on the right there is a small room with a statue holding a shotgun. You're able to remove the shotgun, but doing so traps you in the room. To get your hands on the shotgun properly, you need to replace it with either a broken shotgun or a model one. The broken shotgun is stronger, and can be fixed with a repair kit at a later date, so you can always come back and swap them. There are also several antique coins hidden around, which are not only collectibles, but also serve a purpose more than getting an achievement. The collectible coins can be used to open up bird cages, which have items such as the all-powerful Magnum, and steroids which permanently increase your maximum health. One of the smaller parts of the game that I really just love are the VSH tapes. These can be found left around the baker's house, and each one of them, when played in a VSH player, lets you go through a segment from the past, giving some context to the events currently going on. A few of these can be truly unnerving, especially a certain one in particular. Sometimes watching these VSH tapes will give you a good idea of what horrors await you in the coming up section of the game. When you complete the game for the first time, you will unlock the hardest difficulty in the game, Madhouse. What makes Madhouse especially interesting is that not only is it pretty brutal, but it also changes parts of the game. For one, loot is not only far more scarce, but the spawns are also changed in a lot of cases, whereas enemy spawns are also mixed up and more plentiful, with enemies like Jack appearing in certain cases where he didn't before. Another change is that there is almost double the amount of antique coins, with more bird cages being added for them to be used on. As you could imagine, you most likely will be dying a lot, especially on a first playthrough of Madhouse. But saving now requires a new item, the cassette tape, which isn't too common to come across, adding a further challenge to the game mode. If you do manage to complete the game on Madhouse, you will get the reward of an item which can be used on further playthroughs, which grants infinite ammo when it is in your inventory. There are several other similar rewards which can be gained by completing similar challenges. For example, if you complete the game in under 6 hours, you gain access to a pair of glasses, which when in your inventory, highlights where items are, and a new powerful melee weapon, the Circular Saw, which has 2 types of attacks. You also get a very powerful pistol which can only hold 3 bullets at a time for completing the game. These rewards give a pretty decent incentive to go back and replay the game, while trying to complete challenges such as destroying all the Mr. Bobbleheads, since having these items can make future playthroughs, especially on Madhouse, far easier. In the weeks after the initial release of Resident Evil 7, 2 DLCs would be added to the game, Banned Footage Volume 1 and Volume 2. Each of these DLCs added 3 new game modes, with Volume 1 adding Nightmare, Bedroom, and Ethan Must Die, while Volume 2 added 21, Daughters, and Jack's 55th birthday. In Nightmare, players return once more to the shoes of Clancy, a victim of the Bakers whose story can be seen in some of the VSH tapes in the main game. Trapped in the basement, players must defend themselves until dawn against multiple waves of Molded, and occasionally, Jack himself. There are 2 machines immediately available to players which produce scrap. This scrap can be used to purchase weapons, ammo, and upgrades to help defend against the 5 waves of enemies. One of the items which can be purchased using scrap is corrosive, which can be used to open up locked doors, giving players access to more rooms and scrap machines to increase scrap output. You do need to be cautious though about spending scrap, because the more ammo of a certain type you buy, the higher the price of that ammo becomes. This means you have to be slightly strategic about what ammo you buy, since you want to save the more powerful ammo for the end of waves when you either have to defeat every enemy or take on Jack. You receive a score when you either win or lose, and that score goes towards unlocking more items for Clancy to use in further playthroughs. The second mode, called Bedroom, sees Clancy captured by Marguerite and locked in a bedroom with a not so appetizing looking meal. This is essentially an escape room game mode, but where a guard, in this case Marguerite, comes in if you make too much noise. She also takes notice if anything major is out of place, so you end up having to try to cover your tracks as best as possible so she doesn't realise that you've been trying to escape. Unlike Nightmare, there isn't really much of a reason to replay it, but it still is a really good time. If you enjoy a challenge, Ethan Must Die might be right up your alley. It is a truly brutal experience, the enemies being so strong that they can usually one-shot you if you don't manage to guard in time. The quality of loot in its locations is randomised, but the spawns of enemies remain constant, meaning that it is not totally impossible to plan ahead. When you die, all but one random item is lost, and to recover it, you have to retrieve it from a small statue where you died. The first game mode in Volume 2 is 21, which literally is just Lucas Baker's brutal take on Blackjack. You play as Clancy again in multiple rounds against another victim of Lucas's, Hoffman, with gory forfeits for losing. What mixes the game up is the introduction of trump cards, which can affect both the deck and the level of punishment the loser receives. It really reminds you just how sadistic Lucas can be with some of the twists he throws into the game in the final rounds. Daughters is the most story central of any of the banned footage by far. It gives insight into how the Bakers became the monsters that we know them as, with it being shown through the perspective of Zoe at the very beginning of the Bakers' insanity. Unfortunately, despite it having 2 endings, the experience is extremely short, with there not really being much to talk about. The final game mode in Volume 2 is Jack's 55th birthday. This sees you play as Mia, trying to feed Jack his birthday meal by finding the food while fending off the Molded. The food takes up inventory room, meaning you have to balance between having weapons or being able to carry more food at a time. It's an entertaining little mode, but nothing more. Between the two, I personally think Volume 1 is far better, with the content in it being more entertaining, although Volume 2 is still good as well. Next DLC was called Not a Hero, which was teased at the end of the main game. It ended up being delayed until the very end of the year, with it being released for free alongside the final DLC End of Zoe on the 12th of December the same year. In Not a Hero, you play as Chris Redfield from previous Resident Evil games. He is sent into the mines near the Baker estate to hunt down Lucas Baker after a previous squad had been taken down and placed into his traps. Quickly, Chris is caught in a trap himself and starts a race against time to hunt down and capture Lucas before he can escape. This DLC has a much faster pace than the main game, with a fair higher amount of player on molded combat. The molded appear not only more frequently, but in greater variety, with several new variants, some of which are immune to all but a new type of ammo. Chris is stronger than Ethan, making fighting far easier, something which not everyone may like, since it does take away from the fear factor. I feel, as a one-off DLC, it works well and does have its tense moments. Clearing enemies out the way in the tight mine corridors is much easier since Chris can punch stunned enemies, either killing them or knocking them down. There is a return of antique coins and bird cages, though it is far more limited than in the main game. Lucas has left traps within the mines, but there isn't anywhere near as many as you may expect, although do still be careful. The final DLC, End of Zoe, takes place after all the others. It focuses on Jack Baker's brother, Joe, as he returns to the Baker's home only to find Zoe in a coma-like state, with soldiers and moulded everywhere. Joe sets out to try and find an antidote to save his niece, while being relentlessly hunted by a new moulded monster, and dealing with gators. Joe doesn't need anything silly like guns, instead relying on his fists to beat the shit out of every enemy foolish enough to get in his way. There are some devastating combos he can release to quickly deal with individual enemies, as well as being able to stealth kill enemies from behind. In the swamps around the Baker's house, Joe can find boxer effigies, which have a stackable effect that increases the damage of his punches. Joe does also have access to both throwing spears and homemade spike bombs to help him deal with enemies from a range, which is especially helpful for the crawling moulded type, which for some reason seem to be far stronger in this DLC. As DLCs go, I would say that this games are overall of a good quality, and goes to add to the game's experience. Resident Evil 7 has had an interesting impact on the franchise. It seems to have set the franchise back in the direction of a survival horror series, and what has been seen so far of Resident Evil 8 seems to support the idea that this is the new norm for Resident Evil, at least for the foreseeable future, which is something I am completely fine with.